Lieutenant Aaron Briggs gasped awake. His lungs burned as if they had been scrubbed raw. The air was too clean, so clean that it almost felt unnatural, sterile, like something was missing. He coughed, but no dust, no scent of metal, no trace of human sweat filled his nose. Just cold, empty perfection. He tried to move, but something held him down. His arms and legs were strapped to a sleek, white table, the material smooth and unyielding. He struggled, but the restraints didn't budge. A soft humming filled the air, and a dim, sterile light bathed the room. Panic surged in his chest. Where was his team? The last thing he remembered was the mission, the infiltration of the Valeth orbital facility. They had breached the hull using experimental cloaking technology. Everything was going according to plan. Then, an energy surge had knocked out their systems. Darkness, silence, and now, this. A voice echoed through the air, calm, mechanical, emotionless. Subject stabilized. Cleansing process complete. Contaminants removed. Adaptation in progress. Briggs turned his head, searching for the source of the voice, but there were no speakers, no visible screens, just the endless, sterile white of the walls. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. He was in enemy territory, and that meant one thing. Survival came first. With a sharp inhale, he tested his restraints again. His muscles burned with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. The straps were tight, too tight. Not made of metal or cloth, but some alien material that felt like liquid steel. Then the silence broke. A hiss, a panel in the wall slid open, and a figure stepped inside. Tall, lithe. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were large, colorless voids. A Valeth. Briggs had seen them before, but only from a distance. The galactic community whispered about them. An ancient, hyper-intelligent race obsessed with purity. They didn't conquer through war. They didn't need to. They assimilated, purified, perfected. The Valeth observed him with an almost clinical curiosity, tilting its head slightly. "You are adapting well," it said in a voice so smooth it barely sounded spoken at all. "Most do not survive the cleansing." Briggs grit his teeth. Cleansing. The Valeth stepped closer. "Your body has been rid of all imperfection, pathogens, instinctual aggression, unnecessary biological chaos." It paused. "You are now acceptable." A chill ran down his spine. Acceptable. What did that mean? The restraints suddenly clicked open. His arms fell to his sides, but his body felt weak, too weak. He tried to push himself up, but his muscles barely responded. A wave of dizziness hit him like a hammer. "What did you do to me?" he growled. The Valeth gestured toward the glowing walls. "You were flawed. Now you are corrected." Briggs forced himself to sit up. Every breath felt lighter, as if something had been stripped away from him. His heart rate was slow. Too slow. He clenched his fists again, but even the act of tensing his muscles felt wrong. Then the real horror set in. His rage, the burning anger he should have felt for his fallen team, for being captured, for being experimented on. It wasn't there. He knew he should be furious, but the emotion wouldn't come. It was as if it had been washed away. His pulse quickened. No, 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 no. He couldn't have lost that. He wouldn't. "Where's my team?" he demanded. The Valeth observed him for a moment before raising a slender hand. A holographic projection flickered to life beside them. Briggs's breath caught in his throat. Rows of humans, standing motionless in the same sterile white room. Their faces were blank, eyes empty. They were alive, but they weren't human anymore. Briggs staggered to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. "What did you do to them?" "They are at peace," the Valeth said. "They have been freed from the burden of their imperfection." Briggs's heart pounded. This wasn't just a prison. It was something far worse. He had to get out, had to fight. But as he clenched his fists, he realized he didn't even feel the urge to throw a punch. And that terrified him more than anything. Briggs took a step forward, but his legs felt sluggish, as if his body was resisting the movement. His breath came too easily, his lungs inhaling air so sterile that it felt artificial. There was no scent, no weight, no trace of life. The feeling made his skin crawl. His team stood in perfect rows on the holographic screen, their bodies motionless, their eyes empty. They weren't restrained. They weren't struggling. They weren't even blinking. They just stood there. Briggs turned back to the Valeth, his jaw tightening. "You did something to them. They are free," the Valeth said with the same eerie calm. "Freed from the chaos of their biology. Their minds are clear. Their bodies purified. They will never feel pain, never feel anger, never be burdened by the flaws of their species again." Briggs clenched his fists. A flicker of anger rose inside him, but it was weak, like a distant memory rather than a real emotion. His heart didn't race the way it should have. His muscles didn't tense with the usual fire of adrenaline. He knew he should be furious. He should be planning his next move. But instead, there was only a dull pressure in his chest, where his instincts used to be. He forced himself to focus. The first rule of survival: gather information. Briggs took a slow breath and scanned the room. The walls were smooth, seamless, with no visible doors or exits. The air had a faint hum, like hidden machines working behind the walls. If there was a way out, it wasn't obvious. His mind raced, pushing past the fog clouding his thoughts. He needed a plan. "What happens to me?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Do I join them?" The Valeth tilted its head slightly, as if analyzing him. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you choose to embrace perfection." Briggs almost laughed, but even that reaction felt muted. He took another step forward, testing his balance. His body still felt wrong, lighter, slower, but his mind was working, even if something inside him was missing. He had to hold on to that. "I want to see them," he said, nodding toward the hologram. "My team." The Valeth's pale, translucent face didn't change, but something in its gaze shifted. It was studying him, watching, looking for something. Then, with a soft chime, the walls rippled like liquid glass, and a doorway appeared. "Then come," the Valeth said. Briggs didn't hesitate. He stepped through the doorway into a long corridor bathed in white light. The air was unnaturally still, the silence pressing against his ears. The Valeth walked ahead of him, with smooth, measured steps, its feet making no sound against the floor. As they moved deeper into the facility, Briggs saw more of them. Valeth standing in motionless clusters, their colorless eyes flicking toward him as he passed. None of them spoke. None of them even acknowledged each other. It was as if they weren't individuals at all, just pieces of a single vast intelligence. The corridor opened into a large chamber, and there they were, his team. They stood in perfect formation, their bodies still, their faces blank. Their armor had been removed, replaced by the same seamless white fabric the Valeth wore. Every muscle was relaxed, every expression empty. Briggs stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Gibson," he called. "Mason?" No reaction. He moved in front of Sergeant Gibson, waving a hand in front of the man's face. Nothing. Briggs swallowed hard. "Gibson, it's me." Slowly, the surgeon's head turned toward him. His eyes met Briggs's, but there was no recognition. No spark of humanity, just cold, vacant clarity. Briggs felt his breath hitch. "What did you do to them?" he whispered. The Valeth stepped beside him. "We removed their chaos." Briggs turned sharply. "You lobotomized them." "We perfected them," the Valeth corrected. "They are no longer burdened by the primitive flaws of their species. No hunger, no rage, no pain, They have achieved peace. Briggs felt a fresh surge of anger rise inside him. But again, it was distant, muffled. The realization sent a wave of fear through him. They were doing it to him too. Not all at once, not like his team, but slowly, bit by bit, stripping away everything that made him human. His hands clenched into fists. He had to fight this. He had to fight now. He turned back to Gibson and grabbed the man's shoulders. "Gibson, listen to me. You're a soldier, a fighter. You have to snap out of this." Gibson blinked once, slowly. Then he spoke. "There is nothing to fight." Briggs shook his head. "That's not you talking. That's them. You have to fight it." Gibson's face remained calm. His voice was steady, almost robotic. "Why resist peace?" Briggs felt his grip tighten. "Because this isn't peace. This is death." The Valeth stepped forward. "You do not understand," it said. "Your kind is weak because it is chaotic. We have removed that chaos. In time, you will accept it." Briggs turned to face the alien, his jaw tight. "And if I don't?" The Valeth regarded him for a moment. "Then you will be corrected." Briggs's pulse pounded. He had no weapons, no backup, no way of knowing how much longer before his own mind was stripped away like his team's. But one thing was clear. If he didn't escape soon, he wouldn't escape at all. Briggs forced himself to stay calm, but every second that passed felt like sand slipping through his fingers. His team was standing right in front of him, but they were gone. Their bodies were here, but their minds, the fire, the instincts, the defiance, had been wiped away. The sterile perfection of the Valeth had consumed them, and it was creeping into him too. He had to act. Now. His mind was still working, even if his emotions felt duller, even if his instincts were slipping away. That meant there was still a chance. The Valeth had been patient with him so far, studying him, waiting for him to accept perfection. That was their weakness. They thought he was already too far gone to fight back. Good. Let them think that. He exhaled, letting his shoulders relax, mimicking the empty posture of his team. "You're right," he said, forcing his voice to sound even. I feel it now. The peace." The Valeth tilted its head, studying him with its large, colorless eyes. "You are accepting the truth." Briggs nodded. "Yes, I understand now. There is no need to fight." The words tasted like poison in his mouth, but he kept his expression neutral. The Valeth stepped closer, watching him carefully. He could feel its presence looming over him, its unnatural stillness making the air feel heavier. "If you have truly embraced the path of perfection," the Valeth said, "then you are ready to assist us." Briggs hesitated. "Assist?" The Valeth turned away and gestured toward the far side of the chamber. A section of the wall shimmered and melted away, revealing another room. Inside, a massive console pulsed with a soft blue glow. It was sleek, seamless, alive with alien technology. He didn't need to ask what it was. He knew. A control system. For what? The facility. The cleansing process. The fleet? It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was something he could use. "The next wave of cleansing begins soon," the Valeth continued. "Your species resists, but that will change. With time, all will be purified." Briggs swallowed the bile rising in his throat. They were planning to do this to more humans. Maybe all of them. This wasn't just an experiment. It was an invasion without war. A slow, quiet extermination. And they wanted him to help. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the console. There were no buttons, no switches. Just smooth glass-like surfaces that pulsed beneath the alien's touch. The Valeth raised a slender hand, and the console reacted instantly, glowing brighter. "We are connected to your people," it said. "Your knowledge will assist in optimizing the transition." Briggs could feel the weight of its gaze on him, waiting for his response. He nodded slowly, keeping his expression blank. But inside, his mind was racing. This was his chance. If he could access the system, sabotage it, disrupt it, anything, he might be able to shut down whatever process they were using to cleanse human minds, maybe even wake up his team. But he had to be careful. One wrong move, and they would know. He stepped toward the console, watching as the alien symbols pulsed beneath his fingers. The interface reacted to his touch, shifting and rearranging. He didn't understand the language, but he could recognize patterns, data streams, command prompts, activation sequences, if he could just find the right one. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Gibson. He had turned his head slightly, watching. Briggs felt a jolt of hope. Was he waking up? Could he still fight it? But then Gibson spoke, his voice calm, steady. "You are making a mistake, Lieutenant." Briggs froze. The Valeth's gaze flickered between them. Ah, he is aware. Briggs's blood ran cold. Gibson stepped forward, his posture still unnervingly relaxed. "The cleansing has removed the weakness from us, Briggs. I can see it now. The struggle, the pain, it was all unnecessary." Briggs shook his head. "They took you, Gibson. They rewired your brain." "No," Gibson said, his eyes eerily calm. "They freed me." Briggs clenched his fists. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Gibson had been one of the strongest men he knew, a born soldier, a fighter. He had survived battles that should have killed him. But now he spoke with the same cold detachment as the Valeth. And worst of all, he truly believed it. Briggs took a slow breath, his mind scrambling for a way out. He was surrounded. The Valeth was watching him. Gibson, his own teammate, was now his enemy. And the moment they realized he wasn't truly accepting perfection, it would be over. He glanced at the console again. The data streams pulsed, shifting in patterns that almost made sense. He had one chance. "I understand now," Briggs said, keeping his voice calm. He placed his hand against the console, fingers brushing over the alien symbols. "I want to help." The Valeth watched him closely. "Then proceed." Briggs nodded, his eyes scanning the interface. He had to move fast. His fingers danced over the surface, triggering what he hoped were system commands. A ripple ran through the console, the soft blue glow flickering slightly. Gibson stepped closer. "What are you doing?" Briggs ignored him. His heart pounded as he worked. A sudden sharp chime echoed through the chamber. The Valeth's head snapped toward the console. "What is?" Briggs didn't let it finish. He lunged. His body still felt sluggish, but he poured every ounce of strength he had into the movement. His fist connected with the Valeth's chest, sending it stumbling back. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Alarms blared as the console flickered wildly. Briggs had done something. He didn't know what, but it was enough to disrupt their system. Gibson's face remained emotionless. "You are making a mistake." Briggs turned to run. Pain exploded through his back. A shockwave of energy ripped through his body, dropping him to his knees. His vision blurred, his limbs convulsing. Through the haze, he saw Gibson standing over him, a sleek alien weapon in his hand. "I told you, Lieutenant," Gibson said quietly. "There is no need to fight." Briggs gritted his teeth, his body screaming in pain. But even through the agony, he felt something else. The fire. The raw, human instinct that the Valeth had tried to strip away. It was still there. And as long as it burned, he wasn't done yet. Briggs lay on the floor, his body trembling from the energy surge. His limbs felt like dead weight, his muscles twitching uncontrollably. The pain was sharp but distant, as if his nerves were struggling to process it. His breathing was shallow, but his mind was still his. The Valeth hadn't taken that from him yet. Through the haze, he saw Gibson standing over him, the alien weapon still humming in his hand. His former teammate's face was calm, empty, stripped of all the fire and grit that had once defined him. "You can still join us, Lieutenant," Gibson said. "There is no need to suffer." Briggs forced a breath through clenched teeth. His body ached, his vision blurred at the edges, but he refused to let go. He wasn't done yet. He let his head slump forward, feigning weakness. "You're right," he muttered. Gibson crouched slightly. "You understand now." Briggs inhaled slowly. Every muscle in his body protested, but he willed them to move. His fingers curled into fists. His heart pounded. Then he struck. With every last ounce of strength, Briggs surged forward, slamming his fist into Gibson's throat. The soldier stumbled back, choking on the sudden impact. The alien weapon clattered to the ground. Briggs didn't hesitate. He lunged for it, his body screaming in protest. His fingers wrapped around the smooth, cold metal just as Gibson regained his balance. Briggs rolled onto his back, raising the weapon. He fired. A burst of searing blue energy struck Gibson square in the chest. For a split second, his face flickered with something. Shock, confusion. But then his body went rigid. He collapsed, unmoving. Briggs didn't wait to see if he was dead or just unconscious. He pushed himself up, gasping for air. The console was still pulsing wildly, alarms blaring through the sterile white chamber. Whatever he had done, it had sent a shock through the Valith system. He stumbled forward, gripping the weapon tightly. The Valith that had been watching him now moved with eerie precision, gliding toward him like silent phantoms. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "You resist even now," one of them said. "Your chaos blinds you." Briggs fired. The alien barely had time to react before the bolt of energy struck it. The impact sent a ripple through its translucent form, and for a moment, its entire body flickered, like a hologram losing power. Then it collapsed into itself, its form twisting, breaking apart into a fine mist before vanishing completely. Briggs didn't know if he had killed it or just disrupted whatever held it together, but he didn't care. He had bigger problems. More Valith were appearing, emerging from the walls as if the structure itself had birthed them. Their movement was fluid, unnatural. Briggs turned and sprinted toward the console. He didn't have much time. His fingers flew across the smooth surface, searching for anything. An override, a shutdown, something to tear this place apart. The alien symbols shifted beneath his touch, reacting, but he didn't know what they meant. The Valith closed in. One of them reached for him, its pale fingers extending. Briggs slammed his fist against the console in frustration. Come on, come on." Then something changed. The lights flickered. The hum in the air grew louder, almost like a pulse, a heartbeat deep within the walls. The Valith hesitated. Briggs looked up, realization hitting him. The system was destabilizing. Whatever he had done, whatever sequence he had triggered, it was spreading. The sterile, lifeless perfection of this place was cracking. And then the screams started. Not from him, not from the Valith, from his team. Briggs spun around just in time to see Gibson convulsing on the ground, his face twisted in pain. The other soldiers, the ones who had been standing still like statues, were collapsing one by one. Their bodies shook violently, their eyes wide with confusion. Fear. They were waking up. Briggs felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. The Valith moved fast, faster than before, their calm shattered by the unexpected chaos. One of them lunged at Briggs. He barely dodged, rolling to the side as its elongated fingers slashed through the air where his head had been moments ago. Another one raised its hand, and a pulse of energy shot toward him. He ducked, feeling the heat of it grazed past his shoulder. The soldiers were still struggling, their bodies racked with pain. They weren't ready to fight yet. He had to buy them time. Briggs raised the alien weapon and fired again. The shot hit another Valith, sending it staggering back. But more were coming. His mind raced. He needed something bigger, something that would tear this entire place down. Then he saw it, the core. Beyond the console, deeper into the chamber, a massive crystalline structure pulsed with energy. A reactor or something close to it. If he could destroy it. Briggs didn't think. He ran. A Valeth lunged, but he threw his shoulder into it, knocking it aside. Another one fired a pulse of energy. He felt the heat sear across his ribs. But he kept moving. The reactor pulsed like a living thing, its energy swirling in brilliant blue and white. It was humming, vibrating, as if the entire structure depended on it. Briggs gritted his teeth. He raised the weapon. He fired. The first shot struck the surface, sending cracks rippling through it. The hum turned into a shriek, a high-pitched wail that shook the chamber. He fired again. The reactor shattered. A wave of energy exploded outward, throwing Briggs off his feet. The Valeth shrieked, their bodies flickering wildly, distorting, breaking apart. The chamber itself began to collapse, walls splitting, the sterile white light turning blood red. Briggs hit the ground hard, pain lancing through his body. He forced himself up, his vision swimming. His team, Gibson, Mason, the others, were groaning, stirring. The grip of the Valeth was breaking. "Move," Briggs shouted. "Get up. We're getting out of here." The soldiers, still dazed, staggered to their feet. The facility was coming apart around them. Briggs grabbed Gibson, pulling him up. His teammates' eyes were clearing, recognition returning. "Lieutenant." Gibson's voice was hoarse, uncertain. "No time. Run." They moved, pushing through the chaos as the walls trembled. The Valeth were fading, their forms breaking apart like mist in the wind. Briggs didn't look back. He didn't stop. They burst through the collapsing corridors, sprinting toward whatever exit they could find. Behind them, the reactor let out one final deafening scream. And then the world exploded. Briggs gasped as he hit the ground, rolling over debris and landing hard on his side. His ears rang, his vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay awake. The sterile world of the Valeth was collapsing behind him, its pristine walls breaking apart like fragile glass. Around him, his team lay sprawled on the rocky ground. The force of the explosion had sent them flying, but they were alive. Briggs pushed himself up onto his elbows, coughing as the air filled with dust and smoke. The artificial sky above the Valeth stronghold flickered like a dying hologram, revealing the real world beyond. The rough, imperfect, and very human landscape of the ruined earth. The Valeth facility was dying. The ground beneath it cracked and crumbled, the once immaculate structures now reduced to ruins. A strange, unnatural mist seeped from the collapsing corridors, dissolving into nothing as it touched the air of the real world. The illusion was breaking. Briggs turned his head. His squad, his people, were stirring. Mason groaned, rolling onto his back, his face smeared with dirt. Gibson was breathing heavily, his hands shaking, but he was awake. The others coughed and struggled, blinking as if waking from a long nightmare. Briggs pushed himself up. His legs were weak, but he forced them to work. He stumbled over to Gibson, gripping his shoulder. "You with me?" Gibson looked at him, his eyes still unfocused. But then something clicked, and he nodded. Yeah, I think so." Briggs exhaled, relief flooding through him. "Good. We're not dead yet." Behind them, the Valeth facility let out a final, haunting hum before collapsing completely. A shockwave of energy pulsed outward, but it was weaker now, fading, dying. Briggs turned to look at the sky. It was no longer the artificial white glow of the Valeth world. It was dark, stained with smoke and pollution, the way Earth's sky had always been. The air smelled real, dusty, thick, filled with the scent of burning metal and damp earth. It was nothing like the clean, lifeless air of the Valeth. It was filthy. It was imperfect. It was home. Briggs let out a breath. He hadn't realized how much he had missed it. Gibson sat up, rubbing his face. What the hell happened? Briggs glanced at the ruins behind them. "We broke it. Whatever hold they had on you, it's gone now." Gibson swallowed, his jaw tightening. He hesitated. I remember things. Like I was dreaming, but awake. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. They'd made it seem so. Right. Like we belonged there. Briggs nodded. That's how they get you. Perfection isn't a choice. It's a prison. Mason let out a bitter laugh. Well, I'd take this shitty, broken world over theirs any day. Briggs helped Gibson to his feet. Dan right. The other soldiers were regaining their strength, standing up, shaking off the effects of their time under the Valith's control. Some looked lost, confused. Others just looked relieved. Briggs turned to face them. We made it out, he said, his voice steady. But we're not done yet. The soldiers looked at him, waiting. He pointed toward the horizon, where the remnants of the old world still stood, crumbling cities, rusted machines, the scars of past wars. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The Valith are still out there, Briggs said. We don't know how many, or if they'll try this again, but we know one thing. He looked at each of them, meeting their eyes. They're not invincible, and we don't stop fighting. A slow, determined nod passed through the squad. They had survived. They had broken free. And now they had a war to win. Briggs took one last look at the ruins behind them, then turned toward the world ahead. It wasn't perfect. It never had been. But that was what made it worth fighting for.